Hi, I'm Beth Stroud, and this is lecture 6.3 for HS 117 at Union Theological Seminary. There will be no lecture 6.4 this week because you have a great deal of material to read and to watch. I've decided to give myself a break and to give you a break by only recording one lecture. Instead, I will make a few very brief remarks when we gather on Monday about separation of church and state and disestablishment in the United States. But right now, I would like to talk to you about what is often called the Great Awakening. You'll notice I've put that in quotes. Was there a Great Awakening? I find myself saying this often, but if you attended high school in the United States, you've probably heard of the Great Awakening. In your high school history classes, it may have been described as the first national experience in the United States before the United States became a country, a sudden outbreak of revivals that spread across the colonies in the 18th century prior to the American Revolution. Historian John Butler has famously called the Great Awakening an interpretive fiction, and I'll try to explain why. Yes, I will try to explain why. Here's what we know. The New England pastor and theologian Jonathan Edwards wrote a very eloquent letter describing a revival of religion in Northampton, Massachusetts in the 1730s. It's a beautiful letter. I've assigned the whole thing to you, but don't worry if you can't read it all, but it's lovely. It really gives you a sense of Jonathan Edwards as a pastor and helps us see, I think, a little bit inside the congregational life of a community in New England. It's just a wonderful piece of literature, and if you can't finish it right now, I encourage you to read the whole thing when you can and to sample it at least. We also know that the itinerant British evangelist, George Whitefield, or Whitfield, it's pronounced either way, toured the colonies numerous times between 1739 and 1770, and wherever he traveled, he drew huge crowds. We also know that in the 18th century, the Methodist and Baptist movements grew and spread. Now, historians have made big claims about the Great Awakening. They have said that through these revivals, Americans made a definitive break from European religious and intellectual traditions, which I think in light of Dr. Cameron's lectures, you can probably already tell is not quite true. Historians have also claimed that the revivals fostered a democratic consciousness and contributed to a kind of rising resistance against British power, culminating in the Revolution. Again, sort of questionable. We know that Whitefield was a transatlantic evangelist. His ministry was similar both in Britain and in the United States. Historians have claimed that the revivals represented a spiritual uprising of lower classes against elites. Maybe. And they also say that revival theology was a rejection of Calvinism, which again, assumes that Calvinism is a thing. And as we've already discussed in this course, it's not that simple. John Butler has pointed out that the events in Northampton in the 1730s the events the events of George Whitefield's evangelism tours and the growth of the Methodist and Baptist movements, all of these things happened, but were they necessarily related? It's unclear. We do know, in fact, that there was a second Great Awakening. Early in the 19th century, a religious fervor swept the nation, beginning with a series of camp meetings in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. And it was actually only then, in the midst of these early 19th century revivals, that the events of the 18th century that I just mentioned began to be known collectively as the Great Awakening. So in some way, the idea of the Great Awakening may have its roots in the need, the desire of 19th century evangelists to establish a sort of historical antecedent for their revivals. So what is a revival? Perhaps you've been to one. Perhaps you've experienced one. Revivals are notable either periods or events of intense religious feeling and experience when significant numbers of people are either drawn back to the Christian faith when their faith has maybe grown a little bit cold. They experience, they come to have a renewed fervor, or a time when large numbers of people are converted to Christianity. Though leaders and participants in revivals usually experience them and understand them as a kind of spontaneous outpouring of the Holy Spirit. You can't explain it. People experience the Holy Spirit, its workings. People are mysteriously led to renew their faith or to accept Christ. Skeptics, on the other hand, often think of revivals as productions with orchestrated events and calculated techniques that produce predictable emotional responses. So I'm not a theologian. I have a little bit of background in the sociology as well as the history of religion. I would argue that maybe they're both. I think they are planned, they are orchestrated. Well, except for Jonathan Edwards, maybe not always. But I think that planning and a spontaneous outpouring of the Holy Spirit can sometimes coincide. And I have actually, as I've been an observer and participant in revivals in my own life, I have come to understand that they can be a very effective form of, I would say, of catechism, of making the Christian faith kind of come alive and come into focus for people who have maybe not quite understood it before. So I think they can be a little bit of both. But that's me, trying to straddle the line between evangelicalism and skepticism. I would also say that revivals are a permanent feature of the American religious landscape. If you read American religious history, you'll hear about the Second Great Awakening and the Third Great Awakening and the Businessmen's Revival and the emergence of Pentecostalism. revival is something that happens over and over again in the history of American Christianity, all the way down to the 20th century and the 21st century. Revivals create not only questions for skeptics, but also particularly in their 18th century form, they produce some theological controversy. And I'm not going to say a lot about this, but in a nutshell, revivals raise the possibility of Arminianism, the practice of, say, inviting a large audience to accept Christ, suggests that anyone can be saved, that salvation is universally available. But the question for someone like Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century is the idea of potential universal salvation and the practice of a universal invitation to salvation actually compatible with the idea of God's total sovereignty? In other words, if salvation is potentially available to everyone, yet, as we can observe, not everyone is saved, then doesn't that imply that salvation depends in some way on one's own actions? And that's, I'm not going to get into the weeds with this, but Jonathan Edwards argued that that revival was, in fact, compatible with God's total sovereignty. A little bit about the situation in the British colonies in the 1730s that kind of set the stage for revival. You may have heard of the Halfway Covenant of the 1660s. This was a New England congregational solution to the theological problem of infant baptism. And it wasn't called the Halfway Covenant until the 19th century. But here was the problem for Congregationalists. The visible church was supposed to be composed of, perhaps a mixed multitude of the saved and the unsaved, but to the extent possible, church membership should be, was to be restricted to people who could give some evidence of their salvation, of their election. So fine and good, but then you have faithful, converted families with children. Infants obviously can't give evidence of their election or their salvation. So what do you do? In New England, this led to kind of a real drop-off in church membership, because children who had been baptized as infants were not necessarily showing evidence of election, evidence of salvation. They were not necessarily joining the church and becoming full members. So what to do? They kind of existed in this limbo. So the Halfway Covenant was a theological and polity agreement that people who had been baptized as children could be members of the church. They could be baptized, but they would not be admitted to the Lord's Supper until they could show evidence of salvation. And they could not present their own children for baptism unless they showed evidence of their election. So that's the Halfway Covenant. For Anglicans, there was a different problem. There was a growing population in the colonies that was paired with an inadequate religious infrastructure to sort of gather them into congregations that were, really organized and vital. For example, there were no Anglican bishops, no Church of England bishops in the British colonies for a long time. To that situation, we add the emerging transatlantic Christian movements that you've heard about, emphasizing emotion and experience. For example, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Moravians. And then there was also a growing American print culture. Lots of pamphlets and newspapers that carried word from place to place and facilitated awareness of events that were far apart geographically. And some of you probably have read the work of Benedict Anderson, who describes the result as imagined communities, made it possible for Americans to kind of begin to imagine themselves as a nation with a shared experience. Jonathan Edwards is often considered America's greatest, most original theologian. As you can see from his letter, The Surprising Work of God, he was also clearly a gifted and sensitive pastor. He was both the author and the subject of a truly enormous corpus of literature. And as I've said about his theology, he insisted on God's total sovereignty and articulated it just in a more detailed way. And in that letter, The Surprising Work of God, he describes this event in which especially the young people of Northampton, Massachusetts, were brought to a conviction of sin and to a sense of salvation, and began to take on responsibilities in the life of the church. George Whitefield is an amazing character. He drew enormous crowds, particularly in the early decades of his ministry. He preached to crowds in the thousands, and many sources say tens of thousands. And remember, this was without electric amplification. He was a strategic communicator, and he used the press to promote his revivals. And even Benjamin Franklin was impressed and wrote, "It seemed as if all the world was growing religious." His revival meetings were just a phenomenon, and he preached all up and down the coast of the British colonies. The Methodists and Baptists, who you've heard a little bit about, Methodists and Baptists were uniquely suited to the American geography and population for different reasons. The Methodists, because they had a strong centralized system of itinerant preachers that made it possible for them to get to places where places that Congregationalists and Anglicans could not reach. Baptists, on the other hand, were effective in this landscape because their radical Congregationalism bypassed the need for a centralized organization. Any group of Baptists anywhere could establish a congregation, could ordain leaders. They didn't need anyone's permission to do that. And so that made it possible for them to spread in the British colonies and then in the new United States. You know, I like maps. and explaining things with maps. Just to give you an idea of the geographic situation, this is a map of the parishes, the Anglican parishes in Virginia in, let's see, in about 1730. Each of these divisions is an Anglican parish. And if you can imagine, notice that these are long and narrow peninsulas without bridges in between them. It would be a long journey over land from one of these parishes to another. And that made it difficult to carry out any kind of centrally organized ministry. And so it was in this geography that Methodists and Baptists were particularly successful. I'm going to say, obviously, this is a modern picture. If you have not yet read Slave Religion by Albert J. Rabbitoe, I strongly urge you to read it. If I could require one book for every seminary student to read, this would be the book. It's not a new book. It was published in the 1970s, but it was a survey of the literature on what was known about enslaved people of African descent in the British colonies and the United States before the Civil War. It's a synthetic history, but it was so groundbreaking. It pulled a lot of ideas together, and it has never been superseded. And a personal note, Al Rabbitoe is, in a sense, my academic grandfather. He was the doctoral advisor of my doctoral advisor, and I had a chance to study with him a little bit, and you would never meet a more reverent and compassionate person. And I think one of the reasons I recommend this book is that his reverence for the sources and the people that he was writing about and their experiences is, I think, a model for all historians of religion. And the last moments in this lecture are based on slave religion. One of the results of the events of the 18th century, whether you call it the Great Awakening or not, was a tremendous growth in Christianity among enslaved people. And this church that you see in a photograph from 1921, this church was a result of those events and of that process. The Silver Bluff Baptist Church in Silver Bluff, South Carolina, was the first separate Black church in the South. It was the first congregation that Black people organized for themselves south of the Mason-Dixon line. It was established by a group of enslaved people who had been converted in response to the preaching of a white evangelist. And some of its founders freed themselves and helped others to become free before the Civil War. David George, who was the founding pastor, later established congregations in Nova Scotia, in Sierra Leone. George Liele, who began preaching around Silver Bluff and was connected to David George, later organized the First Baptist Church in Jamaica. And Andrew Bryan, who was converted under George Liele in South Carolina, gathered a congregation in Savannah that had 225 full members and 350 converts by 1790, despite severe persecution by city officials in Savannah. It's just a kind of a magnificent story. Some of the reasons that enslaved people responded to Methodists and Baptists, one was that their emphasis on emotion and experience was more effective for enslaved people who were often prohibited by law from learning to read, as you remember from last week. This emphasis was more effective for them than earlier efforts at evangelism that had emphasized memorization of creeds and prayers. Another reason is that the singing and the bodily expressions of religious experience that Methodists and Baptists encouraged may have resonated with African religious traditions of spirit possession, given what we know about African, some regional African religious traditions. This theory has some credibility. Also, organizationally, these movements were independent from established state churches, and this lent them some credibility with enslaved people, and it gave Methodist and Baptist preachers a little more freedom to preach against slavery. And then Baptist polity, in particular, permitted enslaved people to hold leadership positions, whether they had higher education. Well, without higher education, enslaved people did not have access to higher education, but even without literacy, it permitted the ordination of people, who had evidence of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, whether or not they were literate. Here's some of the key sources I've relied on. And I look forward to talking more about you on Monday with all of these things. Thank you.